Welcome to CEC Gurukul. I am Dr. Meeta Mathur, Associate Professor, Department of English, Sri Aurobindo College, University of Delhi, Delhi. We are going to start a new series on Romantic literature. This literature has a very important place in the British literature. In this lecture, I am going to dwell upon the various characteristics of Romantic literature and also the circumstances that led to this drastic shift from neoclassical to romantics. This term romantic is totally different from what is the general notion of the word that the world has today. Along with the circumstances and characteristics of the romantic literature, I would be discussing some of the poems of William Wordsworth, who is one of the most remarkable of the romantic writers. Amongst his major works, Tintern Abbey, The Prelude and the Immortality Ode are very important, and they reflect the poet's thought in a different light altogether. Now the question is, what is romanticism? It is not the term that we understand today, that a young boy and girl roam around and they are having a romantic relationship. No, it was a literary movement, and it was a revolt against the aristocratic social and political norms of the age of enlightenment, and also a reaction against the scientific rationalization of nature. Romanticism legitimized the individual imagination as a critical authority, which permitted freedom from classical notions of form in art. The Romantic writers completely defied the notion of form and diction of poetry from their writings. The Industrial Revolution also played a great part and influenced Romanticism, which was actually in part about escaping from modern realities. As I said earlier, Romanticism meant imagination, personal feelings. Romanticism was also influenced by Sturm and Drang, a German counter-enlightenment movement that emphasized subjectivity and intense emotion. The writers of that period were inspired by the French Revolution. They were nostalgic about it. They wanted to participate. The French Revolution took place between 1787 and 1799. It denoted the end of ancient regime and established the constitutional monarchy. Wordsworth said, "Bliss it was in that era to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." Though influenced by other artistic and intellectual movements, the ideologies and events of French Revolution created the primary context from which both Romanticism and counter-enlightenment emerged. With the coming of throne in 1660 by Charles II, he had spent 20 years of his life in France. He was totally influenced by the French mannerisms and customs. When he came back to the English throne in 1660, he brought with him the French mannerisms and customs. The literature during that period catered only to the French nobility, the kings and the nobles. But there was a need which was felt, and it was felt that the literature should also be there for the masses. Sturm and Drang was a German literary movement in the 18th century, which literally meant storm and stress. The works during this period were full of high emotionalism and action, usually with an individual dealing with the injustices of society. Romantic movement emphasized the personal, the subjective, the irrational and the imaginative, the spontaneous, the emotional and visionary, which was of transcendental work of art. It gave immense scope for imagination. Romanticism in literature is concerned with the individual and the individual's imagination rather than the society as a whole. The Romantic writers laid great stress upon themselves and their feelings and emotions. It would not be easy to talk about Romantic literature without first talking about William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was writing between 1770 and 1850. It was also an age of industrial revolution and an age of the emergence of a new class, and that was called the middle class. Until now, in Britain, there were only two classes, either the nobility or the higher class or the lower class. There was no middle class. This class of people were neither aristocrats nor from the lower strata. They were the working class, and this was totally a new class which was very keen to read and write. The invention of printing press was also responsible as reading became affordable. Until now, people could not afford reading because the printing press wasn't there and it was very expensive to get the reading material. With the adventure of the printing press, it became easier for people to have their access to reading. For this middle class, the Romantic writers defied the form of poetry and diction for which the neoclassical writers were so particular about. When Johnson, Dryden, Pope and Milton they were writing, they were very conscious of the form that they were writing about, and they were very conscious about the iambic meter, pentameter or their rhyme scheme. The Romantic writers defied everything. They chose the subject that was closer to the heart and comprehension of the common man. The Romantic writers laid stress upon their personal feelings and experience. William Wordsworth was one of the most important founders of English Romanticism. He began writing poetry as a young boy in grammar school, and before graduating from college, he went on a walking tour of Europe. This deepened his love for nature and his sympathy for the common man. Both his love for nature and sympathy for the common man became the major themes in his poetry. Wordsworth's deep love for beauteous forms of the natural world was established too early because his theories and style of writing poetry created a new tradition in English literature. He composed the verse on the free flow of spirituality in nature. He developed a totally different relationship with nature. According to Wordsworth, the source of poetic truth is the direct experience of senses spontaneously. For him, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. He rejected the contemporary stress on form and diction to the writing about strong personal feelings, how he felt about nature, what did he feel about in the presence of nature. He expressed all that in his poetry. Spontaneity and simple language marks the transition in the poetic tradition of the period. These are the very simple and humble surroundings in which William Wordsworth lived, and he catered his senses and sensibilities to. He wrote about only the surroundings where he lived. We would now talk about his most important poem, The Prelude. The Prelude is primarily a philosophy of mind in which the poet chooses himself as the hero. The poetry of the Prelude focuses the struggle of thought and advances it to conclusions. Wordsworth never intended to publish his autobiography until his great philosophical poem, The Recluse, was completed. But as the luck would have it, The Recluse was never completed, and he came to realize that the Prelude must stand on its own merits, and that he must prepare it for the posthumous publication. In style, the simplicity gave place to more decorative literary form. In the early months of 1798, Wordsworth conceived the idea of writing a history of the growth of his own mind. Partly on the suggestion of Coleridge, one of his friends, who was again a literary giant of the same period, he resolved to compose a great philosophic poem to be called A Recluse. He decided to examine how far nature and education had qualified him for his task, and so he wrote the prelude. The inspiration of Wordsworth's poetry had its vitalizing source in the power with which he realized a peculiar experience. The experience begins in sensation and ends in thought, and he writes his poems with emotions recollected in tranquility. First he drinks the nectar of the natural surroundings, then he thinks about it, it sinks in, and then he writes his poems. It was intended both to relate and to be a prelude, the beginning of the poet's imaginative life, eventually down to the year of the publication of the lyrical ballads when he was 28. Lyrical ballads was a combination of Wordsworth and Coleridge's poetry, where both the friends decided to write. One wrote the lyrical part and the other person wrote the ballad part. So they with combined effort, they came out with a combined lyrical ballads. He wrote prelude. It was to be a prelude to a much longer and much ambitious poem, which he hoped would be his greatest literary achievement, a work that was never completed, and hence there was a delay in the publication. The long ambitious poem was The Recluse, and it was to be his views on nature, man and society. In every remembered episode, there is a primary matter of fact, event described vividly and with a sense of joy, but there is also a secondary event that really mattered in the boy's mind and imagination, and that was the awareness of beauty and mystery, or of that purposeful power and life in the whole world of nature. The presence of powerfully repeated actions seems linked with another common element, and that was the emergence of a solitary figure far from the crowd. Because he talked about his own experience, they were very personal, they had nothing to do with the crowd. While skating, the boy Wordsworth detaches himself from the games of his playmates to cut across the reflex of a star. The climax of the nest plundering memory comes at the moment when his own movement checked. The boy hangs on the face of the rock while winds and cloud move for him. The most vivid example of reciprocation is the stolen boat memory in the poem Prelude, Book 1. The boy rows his skiff out into the lake, his eyes fixed on a peak behind as a mark, lustily enjoying his motion through the water. He enjoys nature as carelessly as a young boy can. Suddenly, his own actions bring about another vaster motion, and farther, peak rises up behind his mark. Struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. This is a quote from the prelude itself, Book 1. Because his actions, they are guilty. He has stolen a boat, and the nature's reaction is correspondingly punitive, including the low breathings heard by the boy following him when he stole birds from others' snares. And when you are guilty, your heart, your mind and the nature, they all correspond in the same manner. There is always a guilt attached even to the innocent actions. Running into the fields, innocent running into the fields, suddenly become wantonness, and climbing the trees after eggs become plundering. When you are a small boy, you enjoy the wantonness and you enjoy the plundering, but as you grow up, you realize that you are guilty of something which you ought not to have been doing. At the climax of the stolen boat episode, the language puts us in touch with more severe crime than theft. We read it astonished, and he struck and struck again with his oars, as if in an act more violent than rowing alone. It shows us the mind on the move. The nature of the prelude is indicated by its subtitle, The Growth of a Poet's Mind. The poem, it is a record of author's life from childhood to early middle age. The poem, it has a distinct beginning, a middle and an end. It is not an unfinished story, though it's a very long poem, but it is at the same time of writing this poem, he had reached his poetic maturity, so he could distinguish between the experiences with the natural objects when he was a small boy and when he became young. It is the theory of his early promise, succeeded by disappointment and ending in triumph. It stands in the highest rank among the long poems of the 19th century. It has the varied interest of a great narrative sustained by beautiful and sublime passages. One of Wordsworth's peculiar achievements was to raise poetic autobiography into a region of universal interest. He says, "The poet is a man speaking to men, and we do not lose sight of the human significance in his poetic progress." So a poet has to use such a language which can penetrate the normal human mind and brain. He decided to examine how far nature and education had qualified him for his task, and so he wrote the Prelude. In the Prelude, he wrote his poetical autobiography and penetrates farthest into his inner recesses of mind and shows us the spring of his most unusual psychological insights. His aim is to trace his own development and reveal the process by which he became a poet. It is a very personal poem, as I told you earlier also, that it is almost an autobiographical poem. It focuses the struggle of thought and advances it to original conclusions. The inspiration of Wordsworth's poetry had its vitalizing source in the power with which he realized a peculiar experience. The core of the experience was an intense consciousness of nature, passing through his senses to his mind, and the growth of that consciousness, its action and reaction on his inner life, which is also the main theme of the Prelude. His senses led a very pure and simple life. They fed themselves on the natural surroundings, and this intensity passed on the tide of his feeling into the life of his spirit. Here lies the mystery, which in a very significant line he says, the incumbent mystery of sense and soul. Wordsworth expressed the inner working of his mind as nakedly and truthfully as he could. The Prelude was first published in 1850, shortly after Wordsworth's death. From the beginning of its composition until shortly before its publication, it was more than half a century had passed, but it had remained without a title. It was Mrs. Wordsworth who, after her husband's death, gave the work its name, The Prelude, or The Growth of a Poet's Mind, an autobiographical poem. This was the title given to the poem by Mrs. Wordsworth. In the Prelude, Wordsworth distinguishes stages in the development of an imaginative mind and records a boy's passionate joy in the world of nature and in the very experience of being alive. In the whole of nature, the youth came to be recognized life and the presence of mind. The single theme pervading throughout the poem is the awakening of imagination. Each of the two parts has its own time limit, the first being one of childhood and to the age of about 10 years, and second until the end of school days when the writer was 17 years of age. At that time, he had reached the maturity which some people would not even experience at the age of 25. The first part of the poem gave the boy the glimpse of the darker side of life. The opening lines of the prelude set the date and season of adventure experienced many times by the boy Wordsworth. Often, the key experiences take place in the darkness, with inner illumination by the sudden presence of light. The role of the moon is worth following for its own sake. The moon is depicted or personified as a human being participating in all the actions one experiences. Trees too have a special meaning. A repeated action, an action with guilty overtones, expressive of power and pride, checked and retaliated by a counter motion or a voice precipitating catastrophe, can be experienced in the prelude. It takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated by the author till by a species of reaction and the tranquility gradually disappears and emotional poetry emerges and qualifies kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation. The poetry thus produced actually exists in the mind and heart of the poet. The structure of all the episodes in the prelude fall roughly in three parts. The first part being the tempest of verse, the second quietly active grove, and thirdly the splendid evening ending in serenity. Wordsworth's poetry is valuable for the ideas it expresses. It presents the poet in quest of his own identity. It is a self-reflecting poem, but it is not a self-portrait. There is a difference. It is a self-reflecting and not a self-portrait. It is concerned with the development of sensibilities, and only those aspects and incidents of his life that affected him are included. The prelude is addressed to Coleridge and was first read to him by Wordsworth himself. There are incidents which may appear ordinary, but they are the characteristics of boyhood in general. They are extraordinary in telling. To Wordsworth, the influence of nature on human mind is something more than what human mind can give. In the first stage, we see that nature's sight and sound make their appeal to the heart and imagination of the poet. We can go on and on discussing about Wordsworth's The Prelude, but as students of literature, we need to look at the various aspects of nature, the poet's mind, the similes, the metaphors. He has really made the language more beautiful. The main idea behind the poem, his attitude towards nature, the romantic characteristics in the poem, and why he wrote such a poem, why did he use such themes, why did he use such imagery, is a point of discussion and understanding as the students of romantic literature. I now end this session here and will catch up with the other poems of William Wordsworth in my next session. Thanks.